We're just going to take a moment to bring you a word from our sponsor, The Ridge. This is a photograph of my dad's actual wallet. Who needs a wallet that is that big, bulky, and ugly? It can't be comfortable to carry around, and when it's in the back pocket of his pants, I have no idea how he sits on it. That's why for Father's Day, I'm getting my dad a Ridge wallet, and I think he'll love it. Ridge wallets are sleek and stylish, but they're still incredibly practical. They hold up to 12 cards, plus all your cash. They also fit comfortably into any pocket. Ridge wallets are equipped with RFID blocking, so not only do they look better, but they are also safer. Right now, The Ridge is having an awesome Father's Day sale, and you should check it out. Just go to ridge.com/listed, and you can save 10%, plus get free worldwide shipping and returns. Help your dad ditch the bulky wallet for Father's Day. Help get him a wallet fit for the 21st century by going to ridge.com/listed. Number 3. The Everett Community College Library Fire. In Everett, Washington is Everett Community College. The college was established in 1941 and an average of 19,000 students attend every year. In 1984, the college had a two-story library which contained 48,000 books, 20,000 bound periodicals, and hundreds of student records. Among their collection was a rare copy of History of the World by Sir Walter Raleigh, which was published in the early 17th century. Around 3:15 on the morning of February 16, 1984, a police officer was parked a few blocks from the library. He saw 40-foot flames coming out the roof of the library, so he alerted the fire department. The fire department arrived on the scene, and several firefighters entered the library to battle the blaze. With so many books, periodicals, and other papers in the library, it wasn't long before the fire became intense. Some of the firefighters' helmets even started to melt. Suddenly, a wall collapsed on 4 of the firefighters. 3 of them managed to get out alive and were treated at a local hospital. 48-year-old Gary Parks, an 18-year veteran of the fire department, did not get out on his own, and he had to be pulled out. Eventually, over 100 firefighters battled the blaze, but the library was ultimately destroyed. It was estimated that the damage was about $10 million. Sadly, 48-year-old Gary Parks died from smoke inhalation. Parks was married and he had 2 daughters. It was later determined that the fire was an act of arson. Unfortunately, since the fire was so intense, many potential clues were destroyed. It wasn't long before the case went cold. A suspect emerged nearly 6 years later in February 1993. Between August 1992 and February 1993, there were a rash of arson fires in 4 counties in Washington. Most of the fires were started around the Puget Sound area. Dozens of homes, businesses, and churches were destroyed. It was estimated that the fires caused about $30 million worth of damage. One of the fires in September 1992 was at a nursing home. 3 women, 2 in their 70s and 1 in their 90s, died in the blaze. A task force was started and a sketch of the arsonist was made public. A man named George Keller contacted the task force. He believed that his son, 27-year-old Paul Kenneth Keller, was the arsonist. Paul was arrested and he admitted that he was the arsonist. At the time of Paul's arrest, he was working as an advertising salesman. Paul eventually confessed to setting 76 fires, including the one at the nursing home. He was eventually convicted of setting 107 fires, and he was sentenced to 99 years of prison. The authorities learned that Paul was living across the road from the college campus at the time of the library fire. Several people also claimed that they saw Paul near the library before the fire started. Through his lawyer, Paul Keller denied setting the library on fire, but he refused to talk to detectives about it. The police didn't have any physical evidence that connected Paul Keller to the library fire, so he remained a suspect, but he was not charged. In 2003, the case was reopened. The detective assigned to the case thought about who would want to set the library on fire. It seemed like a pointless and motiveless crime, so he thought that, perhaps, it was the work of a kid. There was a list of 50 potential suspects, so he started looking at the younger people on the list. One of those people was Elmer Nash. Nash was just 12 years old at the time of the fire. He appeared on the list of suspects because some graffiti accused him of starting the fire. Already, by the time he was 12, Nash had several felony convictions for burglary and theft. One time, he set the couch in his home on fire. Nash and two of his friends were also seen near the library on the night of the fire. One of Nash's friends was questioned, and he denied starting the fire. However, he claimed he had a vision of the fire, and he gave some details that had never been made public. He said that the fire had been started with some matches. The detective thought that Nash and his friends were possible suspects, but he found no evidence that would have justified arresting them. So the case was shelved once again. Elmer Nash continued to get in trouble with the law as a teenager and as an adult. As an adult, he had rung up 14 felony convictions and 58 misdemeanors. He was in and out of prison for most of his life. He had never held down a full-time job. 2011, the case was reopened, but no progress was made on it for years. In 2017, one of the detectives who was assigned to the case was at the local jail. He noticed that Elmer Nash was being booked on a different crime. He recognized Nash because he considered him one of the top suspects in the library fire. The detective asked Nash if he would talk to him and his partner, and Nash agreed. At first, Nash denied starting the fire. Then he admitted that he was on the roof of the library that night. Then one of the detectives made a motion that looked like she was sparking a lighter. Nash said it didn't happen that way. He said it was matchsticks. After more questioning, Nash admitted that he and two friends broke into the library, hoping to steal something. Then they started the fire to destroy any evidence that they were in the library. So while the police now had a confession, they did not have an airtight case. The detectives needed something more substantial to tie Nash to the deadly blaze. Over the next several years, the police talked to people who knew Nash. 7 people said that Nash admitted to starting the fire. In the spring of 2021, 47-year-old Elmer Nash was charged with the first-degree murder of Gary Parks. The district attorney offered Nash a plea deal. If he pleaded guilty, they would recommend a shorter sentence. He could have been sentenced to 34 to 45 years of prison. Instead, the district attorney and the defense agreed to a sentence of 3.5 years of prison. But this was only a recommendation. It was ultimately up to the judge when it came to sentencing. After pleading guilty, Nash was allowed to stay out of prison while he awaited sentencing. Nash did not show up for his sentencing on May 13th. The police found him at home, high on drugs. He was arrested and brought to the courthouse. Even though the district attorney and the defense agreed to 3.5 years, Elmer Nash was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He'll also be on parole for the rest of his life. The police have not confirmed or denied if Nash worked alone when he started the fire and they have not said if they plan on making any more arrests. 47-year-old Elmer Nash is currently serving a sentence in the Washington Correction Center in Shelton, Washington. Number 2. Laura Purchase. On March 17, 1983, a Montgomery County Sheriff's deputy was on patrol and he was driving beside a wooded area in Conroe, Texas. He noticed a small fire. He pulled over and went to check it out. It turned out to be the nude body of a young woman who was posed in a sexual position. The fire was put out. An autopsy was performed, and it was determined that the woman had been raped and strangled to death. At the time, the police were not able to determine the identity of the woman. Without knowing who she was, the police had a difficult time investigating her murder. Within a few days, the case went cold. Then, 3 months later, in June 1983, 46-year-old Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in Denton, Texas. After he was arrested, he started confessing to several murders. One of those was the murder of the Jane Doe found in the woods in Conroe. In October 1984, Lucas pleaded guilty to the murder and he was given a life sentence. Eventually, Lucas would be convicted of 11 murders, but he would confess to over 600 murders. For one of his convictions, he was sentenced to death, but his death sentence was later commuted to life in prison. 3 years after the Jane Doe's body was found, in May 1986, the FBI announced that they had identified her by using her fingerprints. She was 26-year-old Laura Marie Purchase from Traverse City, Michigan. Purchase was last known to be living in Houston, Texas a few months before her murder with a man named Howie or Howard who played in a band called Malibu. Her body was found about 40 miles north of Houston. When Purchase was identified, Henry Lee Lucas was recanting his confessions. A growing number of people also realized that he didn't commit nearly as many of the murders as he claimed to have committed. He was also most likely wrongly convicted of most of the murders he was convicted of. Today, it's believed that he probably only committed 3 murders. In February and March 2020, we released 2 videos covering the murders Lucas committed and 3 murders he was wrongly convicted of. We'll have a link to both videos at the end of this video. Henry Lee Lucas died in March 2001 in prison at the age of 64 from congestive heart failure. The investigators working on Laura Purchase's case must have had their doubts about Lucas's guilt regarding her murder because in 2007, the DNA from her rape kit was submitted for DNA testing. The testing eliminated Lucas as a suspect. Lucas claimed he committed many of the murders with his friend and sometime lover, Otis Toole. The DNA did not belong to Toole either. The DNA belonged to an unknown man. In October 2019, researchers started the process of genetic genealogy. In April 2020, the Sheriff's Office in Montgomery County received the report. The report concluded that the DNA most likely belonged to a man named Thomas Alvin Darnell. Darnell was 37 years old at the time of the murder. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Department conducted their own independent investigation, and it also led to Darnell. On March 17, 2021, 38 years to the day of Laura Purchase's murder, investigators went to Darnell's home in Kansas City, Missouri, and they got a sample of his DNA. It was compared to the killer's DNA, and it was a match. On May 11, 1975, Thomas Darnell was arrested for the murder of 26-year-old Laura Purchase. He was subsequently extradited to Texas. He is currently being held there without bond. Not much is known about Thomas Darnell. It's unknown if Darnell knew Purchase before he killed her, or if a chance encounter led to her murder. At the time of this video, a trial date has not been set. Number 1. Julie Hanson. Naperville is a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. In 1972, the population of Naperville was about 22,000 people. It was home to the Hanson family. Jerome and Marguerite Hanson had 3 children, 18-year-old Jill, 15-year-old Julie, and 12-year-old Mark. Jerome was a district sales manager for a trucking company, while Marguerite was a homemaker. They lived in a nice house on a quiet street. On the night of July 7, 1972, Jerome and Marguerite left for the night, and the kids stayed home. At about 7 p.m., 15-year-old Julie set off on her brother's bike. She did not return home that night. Her siblings, Jill and Mark, really didn't think too much about it. They assumed she had probably stayed over at a friend's home. But by the next afternoon, they became worried because Julie still had not returned home or called them. Also, none of Julie's friends or family had seen her since the day before. So in the afternoon of July 8th, Jill reported Julie missing. The police searched the neighborhood, and in a ditch about 2 miles from the family's home, they found the bike that Julie was riding. About 100 yards from the bike, in a cornfield, was the dead body of 15-year-old Julie Hanson. She was fully clothed, and it was clear she had been stabbed dozens of times in the back, neck, and chest. The medical examiner would later determine she had been stabbed 36 times. She had also been sexually assaulted. The police did not identify any suspects in the weeks or months after the murder. Sadly, it wasn't long before the case went cold. In 2019, the police wanted to have the DNA from Julie's murder tested. But unfortunately, it had badly degraded and it was contaminated with bacteria. So they had to hire a special company to create a DNA profile. Luckily, the company was able to create a profile and it was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system, which is also known as CODIS. But no match to the DNA was found. In 2020, the police thought they came up with a potential suspect. Thanks to genetic genealogy, the January 1976 murder of 16-year-old Pamela Maurer had been solved. Pamela was walking to a fast food restaurant in Woodbridge, Illinois, when she was kidnapped, raped, and strangled to death. Woodbridge is only about 6 miles from Naperville. It turned out that Pamela had been murdered by a man named Bruce Lindahl. In April 1981, 27-year-old Lindahl was in the apartment of 18-year-old Charles Huber in Naperville. Lindahl attacked Huber with a knife and stabbed him 28 times, killing him. But during the attack, Lindahl cut his femoral artery and he bled to death in Huber's apartment. After Lindahl's DNA was linked to Pamela's murder, the police thought that Lindahl might have killed Julie Hanson. He was 18 years old at the time of her murder and he was living in the area. His DNA was compared to Julie's killer's DNA, and it was not a match. For more information about Pamela Maurer and Bruce Lindahl, we covered them in 3 decades-old cold cases solved in 2020, Part 2. We'll have a link to that video at the end of this one. After Lindahl was ruled out as a suspect, the police decided to utilize the same technique that solved Pamela's murder, genetic genealogy. On June 2, 2021, nearly 49 years after Julie's murder, the police arrested 76-year-old Barry Lee Wempley at his home in Moundsville, Minnesota. Wepley was 27 years old at the time of Julie's murder. He lived less than a mile from the Hanson family. Not much is known about Barry Wepley. He worked as a welder, but he had retired. He had lived in his neighborhood in Moundsview for about 17 years, but his neighbors rarely saw him. Some neighbors thought that Wepley might have been living with a woman for a while. Several times they saw the woman tending to the gardens, but they don't know who she was or what happened to her. One neighbor said she only remembered talking to Wepley once during the 17 years he lived in the neighborhood. A family that lived on his street said that they had not seen him in the 5 years that they lived there. If Barry Wepley has a criminal record that was not publicly addressed by the authorities, he is currently being held in jail with a $10 million bond. At the time of this video, a court date has not been set. The police are currently investigating to see if Barry Wepley committed any other murders. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In the latest episode, we discuss one of the most notorious mass murders in American history, the List family murders. Even though the police knew exactly who killed them, it would still take nearly 2 decades for the case to be closed. Into the Killing can be found on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere you find great podcasts. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.